Before the ships came, before the sails cut across the endless blue, there was already a world here. A world of nations, languages, cities, and dreams. A world that thrived for thousands of years, rich in art, science, and spirit. This is the untold beginning of America. Long before Columbus ever set foot on these shores, there were people who called this land home. Centuries before Europeans crossed the Atlantic, the American continents were alive with great civilizations. Millions of people living in harmony with forests, rivers, deserts, and mountains that stretched beyond imagination. From the Arctic tundra to the tropical jungles, this was a vast and vibrant world. A tapestry of human ingenuity woven across two continents. In what is now the United States and Canada, thousands of tribes spoke hundreds of languages. Each carried unique traditions, yet shared one profound belief: that the earth itself was sacred. In the Mississippi Valley, mysterious earthen mounds rose high above the plains, remnants of a people known today as the Mound Builders. Their city, Cahokia, near present-day St. Louis, was once home to over 20,000 inhabitants, larger than London or Paris in the year 1200. They built monumental pyramids of earth, aligned with the stars, trading goods and ideas across vast distances. To the northeast, the Iroquois Confederacy, a league of nations, built a system of governance that balanced freedom, unity, and peace. It would later inspire the framers of the United States Constitution itself. Far to the southwest, in the dry canyons and mesas, lived the ancestors of today's Hopi and Pueblo peoples. They built cities of stone, like Mesa Verde and Chaco Canyon, rising out of the desert cliffs, sophisticated centers of astronomy, agriculture, and trade. At night, their people studied the stars. They charted the heavens, recorded the solstices, and aligned their architecture with cosmic precision. These were not primitive tribes, as early colonizers would later claim. They were engineers, philosophers, and artists, masters of a landscape that demanded resilience and respect. Farther south, the story expands to empires that dazzled even the Old World. In Mesoamerica, the Maya built massive stone cities, Tikal, Palenque, Chichen Itza, complete with observatories, pyramids, and roads. Their calendar rivaled modern astronomical accuracy. They wrote books of bark paper, recorded dynasties, and studied the movement of planets long before telescopes existed. The Aztec Empire, centered in Tenochtitlan, modern-day Mexico City, stood as one of the greatest cities on Earth. With canals, marketplaces, and towering temples, it shimmered on a lake, home to hundreds of thousands. And across the Andes, the Inca Empire stretched over 2,500 miles, linking mountains and valleys through a web of stone roads. They carved cities like Machu Picchu into the clouds and built a civilization sustained by unity, order, and faith in their sun god, Inti. Across these lands, trade routes flowed like lifelines: obsidian from Mexico, copper from the Great Lakes, shells from the Pacific, feathers from the jungles. These networks carried not just goods, but stories, beliefs, and traditions. In the Arctic, the Inuit thrived in one of the harshest environments on Earth, crafting tools from bone and ivory, mastering the art of survival on ice and sea. In the great forests of the Pacific Northwest, towering cedar totems told ancestral tales, while ocean canoes carried traders across vast waters. From the plains to the jungles, from the deserts to the frozen north, each culture was a masterpiece of adaptation and creativity. To the peoples of the Americas, the Earth was not something to conquer, it was family. The mountains were ancestors, the rivers, lifeblood, the sky, the realm of spirits and dreams. Ceremonies, songs, and dances honored the balance between all living things. They saw no divide between the sacred and the natural. Everything was part of one great circle of life. This spiritual harmony guided their laws, their art, their way of living. It was a vision of humanity that saw wisdom not in domination, but in respect. By the 15th century, this world had reached a balance, countless nations living and evolving on their own paths. But across the ocean, change was stirring. Explorers, kings, and merchants in Europe dreamed of new trade routes, new lands, and unimaginable wealth. And in 1492, sails appeared on the horizon. With Columbus's arrival began one of the greatest transformations and tragedies in human history. The meeting of two worlds would forever alter both. Before Columbus, America was not an empty wilderness. It was a land of nations, of visionaries, warriors, builders, and dreamers. A continent already ancient, already alive with stories and civilizations. To understand the history of America, we must first honor the world that existed before the discovery, a world that still lives on in the hearts and heritage of indigenous peoples today. In 1492, a voyage changed the world forever. Christopher Columbus, sailing under the flag of Spain, crossed an ocean he barely understood and reached lands he had never imagined. His arrival marked the dawn of a new era, an age of discovery, conquest, and colonization that would reshape the earth itself. The Americas, long home to thriving nations, suddenly became the center of European ambition. Four powers, Spain, France, England, and the Netherlands, began a race for territory, glory, and gold. Spain moved first and with fury. Spanish conquistadors swept through the Caribbean, claiming islands in the name of crown and cross. Driven by faith and greed, they built forts, missions, and cities, and brought with them soldiers, settlers, and priests. But their arrival carried more than weapons. Diseases like smallpox spread faster than any army, devastating indigenous populations who had no immunity. Millions perished within decades. Entire civilizations, once mighty and proud, were shattered. Yet in Spain's wake rose new empires. Across the ocean, France sent explorers northward. Jacques Cartier sailed the St. Lawrence River, claiming vast lands for France. In time, they would call it New France. The French built trade networks stretching from the Atlantic to the Great Lakes, exchanging furs with indigenous nations who became vital partners in a new kind of colonial world. In the frozen forests of Canada, small French settlements grew, more trading posts than cities, where European and native cultures met, clashed, and sometimes blended. French missionaries, known as Jesuits, ventured deep into the wilderness, seeking to spread Christianity and learn native tongues. For the French, colonization was less about conquest and more about commerce and conversion. But the Spanish Empire's reach extended far beyond. By the early 1500s, Spain controlled vast territories. From Mexico to Peru, from the Caribbean to the deserts of the American Southwest. They mined mountains of silver, enslaved indigenous peoples under brutal systems like encomienda, and built cathedrals atop ancient temples. Cities such as Mexico City and Lima became the jewels of Spain's new empire, centers of wealth and power unrivaled in the world. Across the Atlantic, the English watched with envy. Their first attempts at colonization were uncertain, even tragic. In 1587, English settlers landed on Roanoke Island off the coast of modern North Carolina. When supply ships returned years later, the colony had vanished, its people gone without a trace. A single word carved into a tree remained: Croatoan. It was the first mystery of English America. Despite failure, ambition endured. In 1607, under the rule of King James I, the English made another attempt. This time, they sailed up the Chesapeake Bay and founded Jamestown, Virginia. It was the first permanent English settlement in North America. Life there was harsh. Famine, disease, and conflict nearly destroyed the colony. But the settlers persevered. Tobacco, cultivated through the labor of both indentured servants and soon enslaved Africans, became the cash crop that would secure England's foothold in the New World. Meanwhile, to the north, the Dutch arrived with their own dreams of trade. They built New Amsterdam on the island of Manhattan, a bustling port that would one day become New York City. Like the French, the Dutch focused on commerce, sailing powerful ships and establishing colonies from the Caribbean to the Hudson River. Across the continents, the clash of empires had begun. Explorers mapped coastlines, missionaries raised crosses, and conquerors planted flags. The Old World's hunger for wealth and dominion reached across the sea, forever binding Europe and the Americas in a story of power, suffering, and transformation. But this new age was not only a story of nations, it was the beginning of a collision between worlds. Indigenous peoples faced enslavement, displacement, and destruction. Yet they also resisted, adapted, and endured. In Mexico, in the Andes, in the forests and plains of North America, they found ways to survive, to keep their languages, beliefs, and identity alive amid a storm that would last for centuries. By the dawn of the 17th century, the stage was set. Spain's empire ruled from the Andes to the deserts of New Mexico. France had carved out a northern realm of rivers and forests. England had planted its fragile colony in Virginia. And the Dutch traded their way into the heart of the Atlantic world. The Old World and the New were now bound together by ships, by commerce, by blood. From this connection would rise the seeds of a new civilization, one that would call itself America. In 1607, on the muddy banks of the James River, a fragile settlement named Jamestown took its first breath. The English came seeking fortune, not freedom, gold, not glory, but what they found was hunger, disease, and struggle. From that desperate foothold in Virginia, the story of the 13 colonies began. The New World was both promise and peril. Every tree, every river, every winter storm tested the settlers' resolve. Many died. Few thrived, but through hardship came endurance. Slowly, the English colonies began to grow. First Virginia, then Massachusetts, and soon a chain of settlements stretching along the Atlantic coast. In 1620, a small group of English Puritans, the Pilgrims, crossed the Atlantic aboard the Mayflower. They landed far north of their intended destination, in the cold winds of New England. There, they founded Plymouth Colony and signed the Mayflower Compact, an agreement that established self-government, a seed of democracy planted in rocky soil. As decades passed, more settlers came, farmers, merchants, laborers, and dreamers, each seeking a new beginning. By the mid-1600s, the English had established 13 distinct colonies, each with its own character, culture, and ambition. In New England, life revolved around faith, family, and community. The Puritans of Massachusetts built towns centered around churches and schools. They prized education, order, and moral discipline. Their villages echoed with sermons and the sound of printing presses spreading both the Bible and revolutionary ideas. To the south, the colonies of Virginia, Maryland, the Carolinas, and Georgia were different worlds. Their wealth flowed from the soil, tobacco, rice, and indigo. Grown on vast plantations worked first by indentured servants and then by enslaved Africans. From this system of forced labor, a brutal economy was born. The roots of slavery took hold, shaping the moral and political divisions that would haunt America for centuries. Between these two worlds lay the middle colonies, New York, New Jersey, Pennsylvania, and Delaware, diverse, bustling, and tolerant. Founded by traders, Quakers, and immigrants from across Europe, they became centers of commerce and freedom. Philadelphia, the city of brotherly love, emerged as one of the great capitals of the New World, a city where ideas of equality and liberty found fertile ground. Life in the colonies was harsh but vibrant. Town meetings and assemblies gave ordinary men a voice in government. Farmers worked sunup to sundown. Merchants traded goods across the Atlantic, and shipbuilders filled harbors with sails. A new American identity, independent, resourceful, and defiant, began to take shape. Yet the colonies were not isolated. They were part of a vast global web known as the Atlantic world, where trade connected Europe, Africa, and the Americas in what became known as the triangular trade. Ships carried goods from England, slaves from Africa, and raw materials from the New World. The profits built empires, but the human cost was staggering. Millions of Africans torn from their homelands, their suffering forming the dark foundation of colonial wealth. By the early 1700s, the population in the colonies had exploded. Towns became cities, frontier settlements pushed westward, and trade flourished. Despite their differences, the colonies shared one thing in common: they governed themselves. Local assemblies taxed, legislated, and managed their own affairs. Across the ocean, Britain was distant, a distant king ruling through letters and laws that often arrived months too late. This freedom bred confidence and independence. But it also sowed the seeds of conflict. As the colonies prospered, Britain looked to tighten its grip. Mercantile laws demanded that colonial goods be shipped only on English vessels. That trade favored the mother country. Taxes and restrictions began to stir resentment. The colonists wanted opportunity, Britain wanted obedience. Meanwhile, on the frontier, conflict raged with indigenous nations and rival empires. The French and Indian War, 1754-1763, part of a larger global struggle between Britain and France, would prove decisive. When the smoke cleared, Britain claimed victory, gaining vast new lands in North America. But victory came at a price, a massive war debt that London expected its colonies to help pay. To the colonists, this demand felt like betrayal. They had fought and bled for the empire, yet now they were treated as subjects, not partners. When Parliament imposed new taxes, the Sugar Act, the Stamp Act, and later the Townshend Acts, protests erupted from Boston to Charleston. The cry rose loud and clear: no taxation without representation. Across taverns and meeting halls, pamphlets and sermons, a radical idea began to spread that liberty belonged to all men and that government must serve the people, not rule over them. Writers like Thomas Paine, preachers, and local leaders stirred a new sense of destiny. The colonies were no longer children of an empire, they were becoming a nation in waiting. By the 1770s, tension had turned to outrage. The Boston Massacre stained the streets with blood. The Boston Tea Party defied royal authority. The British Crown responded with force, sending troops to enforce order. But the more Britain demanded obedience, the more the colonies united in resistance. 13 distant colonies, once divided by region and religion, now stood together against a common oppressor. They had built towns, farms, and lives in a land they no longer saw as foreign. To them, this was home, and freedom was worth any price. From Jamestown's muddy shores to the bustling wharves of Boston, a spirit had awakened, bold, restless, and unyielding. The children of England had become Americans, and soon they would rise to declare a new birth of freedom. By 1775, the tension between Britain and her colonies had become unbearable. Protests, boycotts, and bloodshed had replaced loyalty. The 13 colonies that once saw themselves as English now stood at the edge of rebellion. The spark that would ignite the revolution was about to be struck. In April 1775, British troops marched toward Lexington and Concord, Massachusetts, to seize colonial weapons and arrest rebel leaders. But the colonists were ready. Farmers and tradesmen, the Minutemen, stood armed on the village green. A shot rang out. No one knew who fired it, but its echo would shake the world. The shot heard round the world had begun the American Revolution. The British retreated under heavy fire, harassed by men who knew the land better than any army. What began as a skirmish turned into war. Within weeks, militias across New England rose up, and Boston found itself surrounded by thousands of armed patriots. In Philadelphia, delegates from all 13 colonies gathered for the Second Continental Congress. They were not yet united in calling for independence, but they agreed on one thing: the colonies must defend themselves. They appointed a quiet, tall Virginian named George Washington to command the new Continental Army. Washington took command outside Boston in June 1775. He found a ragtag force, poorly trained, poorly armed, and short on everything but spirit. Across the harbor, the mighty British Army held Boston with thousands of redcoats and naval guns. The odds could not have been more uneven. The first major clash came at the Battle of Bunker Hill. The colonists dug in and waited as British troops advanced in waves. Twice the redcoats were driven back. Only on the third charge did the Americans retreat, their ammunition gone. Though technically a British victory, the heavy casualties shocked the empire. The message was clear: the colonists would fight and die for their rights. In 1776, the war took on a new dimension, not just a fight for rights, but for independence itself. Voices like Thomas Paine's thundered across the colonies through pamphlets like Common Sense, declaring that monarchy was tyranny and liberty was mankind's destiny. The idea spread like wildfire. In June 1776, a committee led by Thomas Jefferson, John Adams, and Benjamin Franklin drafted a bold new document, the Declaration of Independence. On July 4, 1776, Congress adopted it, proclaiming to the world that the 13 colonies were now free and independent states. The Declaration was not just a statement of rebellion, it was a promise to humanity. It declared that all men are created equal and that government exists only by the consent of the governed. Those words would outlive the men who wrote them, echoing through centuries of struggle and hope. But independence would not come easily. Britain sent massive reinforcements to crush the rebellion. By the summer of 1776, General William Howe arrived in New York with the largest army Britain had ever sent overseas. Washington, commanding the Continental Army, tried to defend the city, but he was outmatched. The Americans were routed in the Battle of Long Island, and New York fell to British control. It was a dark time for the Revolution. Washington's army retreated across New Jersey, pursued by the enemy. Morale was collapsing. Soldiers deserted, supplies vanished, and the dream of independence seemed on the brink of ruin. But on Christmas night, 1776, Washington made a desperate gamble. In freezing winds and icy waters, he led his men across the Delaware River to attack the Hessian garrison at Trenton, New Jersey. At dawn, they struck. The victory was small in scale, but immense in spirit. It reignited hope. A week later, another victory at Princeton confirmed that the American cause was not yet lost. Still, the war dragged on. The British strategy was to isolate New England and crush the rebellion piece by piece. In 1777, their forces marched south from Canada under General Burgoyne, hoping to cut off the northern colonies. But at Saratoga, New York, the Americans, under General Horatio Gates and Benedict Arnold, surrounded and forced Burgoyne to surrender. The victory at Saratoga changed everything. It proved that the Americans could defeat a world power. It also convinced France, Britain's longtime rival, to join the war on the American side. French ships, soldiers, and gold soon flowed across the Atlantic, turning the revolution into a global conflict. Meanwhile, Washington's army endured a brutal winter at Valley Forge in 1777-78. Freezing, starving, and poorly clothed, the soldiers suffered terribly. Yet through discipline and determination, the army was reborn. Under the training of Baron von Steuben, a Prussian officer, Washington's men learned to fight as a unified professional force. By 1778, the war spread south. The British captured Savannah and Charleston, believing they could rally loyalists in the south, but the plan backfired. Patriot militias, using guerrilla tactics, struck back in the swamps and forests. Leaders like Francis Marion, the Swamp Fox, and Nathaniel Greene turned the tide through cunning and resilience. The war reached its climax in 1781. British General Cornwallis fortified his army at Yorktown, Virginia, waiting for reinforcements from sea. Washington saw an opportunity. With French General Rochambeau and the French fleet under Admiral de Grasse, he moved south in secrecy. Together, they surrounded Yorktown by land and sea. In October 1781, after weeks of bombardment, Cornwallis surrendered. The British band played "The World Turned Upside Down," for indeed it had. The mighty British Empire had been humbled by a band of farmers and revolutionaries. The war dragged on in name for 2 more years, but the outcome was clear. In 1783, the Treaty of Paris was signed. Britain recognized the independence of the United States of America, a new nation born from revolution. The victory was more than military. It was philosophical, a triumph of an idea that liberty, equality, and self-government could stand against tyranny. The 13 colonies had defied an empire and, against all odds, had won. But the end of war was only the beginning of a greater challenge: to turn victory into stability and rebellion into a lasting nation. The world watched as America, scarred by struggle yet filled with hope, prepared to define what freedom truly meant.